The air in the John Deere dealership parts department hung thick and heavy with the smell of new rubber, hydraulic fluid, and something else, the cloying scent of easy credit. It was July of 1971, and the place buzzed like a hornet's nest stirred with a stick. Farmers in clean overalls, their faces flushed with the promise of high corn prices, crowded the counter, ordering parts for planters and cultivators, already talking about the new combines they'd need for the fall. Silas Blackwood stood apart from the crowd, his own overalls worn soft and stained with the honest grease of a dozen seasons. In his hand, he held a busted cast-iron pulley, the V-groove worn smooth, and a hairline crack running through its center like a lightning strike. He'd been waiting for 20 minutes while the younger men, slapping backs and talking about buying the neighboring 80, got their shiny new parts in green and yellow boxes. Finally, the parts man, a kid barely out of high school with a wispy mustache, called his name. "Blackwood, got that pulley you were looking for?" He slapped a dusty, new old stock part on the counter. It was the right one, a heavy piece of American steel for the main separator drive on his John Deere 55. "Appreciate it," Silas grunted, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. Before he could lay a $10 bill on the counter, a smooth voice cut through the noise. "Still trying to keep that old museum piece running, Silas?" Silas didn't have to look. He knew that voice. Chet Miller, the owner of the dealership, glided over, smelling of aftershave and ambition. He wore a crisp, short-sleeved shirt and creased trousers, looking more like a banker than a man who sold farm equipment. He gestured at the old pulley with a manicured finger. "That's off the 55, isn't it?" Chet said, a pitying smile playing on his lips. "My God, man, we sold that machine to your father back in, what, 59? 60? 58, Silas corrected him, his voice low and flat as the prairie horizon. "Still runs." Chet laughed, a sharp, practiced sound meant to draw the attention of the other farmers. A few of them turned, their conversations tapering off. Frank Gable, Silas's neighbor to the west, was among them. Frank had just signed the papers on a brand-new 6600 combine, the first one in the county. It was sitting out on the lot, gleaming under the summer sun, its grain tank big enough to swallow Silas's entire machine shed. "Still runs isn't the same as makes you money, Silas," Chet said, leaning on the counter. "You're losing grain over the back of that thing. The cylinder speed is inconsistent. You break down, 2-3 times a harvest? Every hour you're sitting in the fence row with a wrench in your hand, Frank here is putting another 100 bushels in the bin." Frank shifted his weight, looking a little embarrassed but also proud. "He's got a point, Si. The cab on that new one. Air conditioning. Radio. It's like driving a Cadillac." Silas ignored Frank. He kept his eyes on Chet. "This pulley costs $12.50. I'll have it on by supper. Your new 660, whatever costs $30,000. I'll be in the field tomorrow, same as Frank. Only difference is, the bank won't be riding on the buddy seat with me." A murmur went through the small crowd. Talk like that was becoming old-fashioned. The radio was full of ads from the Farmers National Bank, promising expansion loans, equipment loans, operating loans. "Get big or get out," was the new gospel, and Chet Miller was its most fervent preacher. Chet's smile tightened. He saw he was losing the room. He decided to go for the kill. He lowered his voice, making it sound like he was giving Silas some secret, friendly advice. "Listen to me, Silas. I'm trying to help you. We're in a new era. We had a Russian grain deal last year, and the word is there's another, bigger one coming. Prices are going to the moon. The guys who are ready, the guys with modern, high-capacity equipment are going to become millionaires. The guys trying to get by with 20-year-old junk, He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He picked up the cracked pulley from the counter and held it up. "This right here. This is what's going to cost you your farm. Not today, not tomorrow. But one day, you'll be broke down for a week, waiting on a part that doesn't exist anymore. A storm will be rolling in, and your crop will be flat on the ground. You'll lose it all because you were too stubborn to see the future." He dropped the broken part on the counter with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Silas looked at the broken iron, then at Chet's confident, condescending face. He looked at Frank, who was already nodding in agreement with the dealer. He looked at the other farmers, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and smugness. They saw him as a relic, a stubborn old fool chained to the past. Slowly, Silas pushed $12.50 across the counter. He picked up the new pulley, its weight solid and reassuring in his calloused hand. He turned to leave, not saying another word. He didn't need to. His silence was his answer. As the screen door wheezed shut behind him, he could hear Chet's voice rise again, launching into a pitch about the financing options on a new 4x30 tractor. "Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened next, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had a salesman or a boss, or maybe even a well-meaning friend, try to tell you that the old way was the wrong way? That the tool you trusted, the one that never let you down, was obsolete and holding you back? Let me know down in the comments, because Silas Blackwood was about to live that very question for the next 20 years, and the answer would be written in rust and diesel smoke across the fields of Jackson County. Silas didn't go straight home. He drove his dusty Ford F-100 out past the edge of town to Miller's Salvage, a sprawling graveyard of iron dinosaurs. Old Man Miller, no relation to Chet, ran the place. He was a stooped, gnarled man who knew every bolt on every piece of equipment that had ever been sold in the county. "Back again, Si?" Miller grunted, wiping his hands on a red rag that had seen better decades. "That pulley on the 55 finally gave up the ghost," Silas said, holding up the new part. "Got a new one from the dealer, but I figure it's cheap insurance to have a spare." Miller nodded, a slow, knowing gesture. "Good thinking. Chet selling many of them new combines." "Sold one to Frank Gable while I was in there," Silas said, kicking at a pile of rusty sickle guards. "Figures," Miller spat. "Folks got more money than sense these days. Think a coat of new paint and a bank loan makes 'em a farmer. Follow me." He led Silas through rows of dead and dying machines. There were old Alice Chalmers all crops with their canvas conveyors rotting in the sun, Massey Harris clippers listing to one side like sinking ships, and even a few ancient pull-type combines with huge steel wheels. Back in a far corner, covered in trumpet vine, sat the twin of his combine, a John Deere 55, its green paint faded to the color of a dried-out pond, its decals peeling. "Got two of 'em back here," Miller said. "This one's pretty well picked over, but the one behind it came in last year. Engine was shot, but the rest of her is sound." For the next hour, Silas and Miller worked with a breaker bar and a can of penetrating oil, wrestling the same pulley assembly off the salvaged machine. It was hard, greasy work. The bolts were frozen with rust, and Silas had to put his entire weight on the breaker bar, his knuckles scraping against the combine's sheet metal until the bolt finally gave way with a groan of tortured steel. The air was still and hot, filled with the buzzing of horseflies and the smell of sun-baked metal. By the time they were done, sweat was running in rivers down Silas's face, and his hands were black with a grime that wouldn't come off for days. He paid Miller $2 for the part and threw it in the bed of his truck. It wasn't just a spare part. It was a statement of intent. When he got back to the farm, the sun was hanging low in the west, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of orange and purple. His wife, Martha, was standing on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the look on his face. "Chet Miller get under your skin again?" she asked, her voice gentle. "He's a salesman," Silas grunted, heading for the machine shed. "It's his job." The John Deere 505 sat in the center of the shed, its guts exposed. Earlier that morning, the pulley had started to wobble, and Silas had shut it down immediately, knowing the sound of imminent failure. Now, the big separator drive belt hung slack, and the shaft was bare. He set the new pulley from the dealership and the salvaged one from the junkyard on his workbench. 2 was 1, and 1 was none. That's what his father had always said. He spent the next 2 hours working by the light of a single bare bulb. He cleaned the shaft with emery cloth until it shone. He carefully tapped the new pulley into place with a brass hammer, making sure it was perfectly seated against the keyway. He used a straight edge to ensure it was aligned with the other pulleys, knowing that a 1/16 of an inch out of true could shred a new belt in a matter of hours. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, a surgeon operating on his most vital patient. This machine wasn't just a tool, it was a partner. It was the difference between a crop in the bin and a disaster in the field. He knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every groan and rattle it made. Chet Miller saw a museum piece. Silas saw 30 years of harvests, of food on the table, of a farm paid for, free and clear. While he was tightening the last bolt, he heard the roar of a big diesel engine coming down the road. He stepped out of the shed and watched as Frank Gable drove his new 6600 combine home from the dealership. It was a monster, an imposing beast of modern engineering. Its lights cut through the twilight, illuminating the dust kicked up by its massive tires. Frank gave a short toot of the horn as he passed, a triumphant sound that echoed across the quiet fields. Silas just stood there, a wrench in his hand, and watched until the tail lights disappeared over the rise. He felt a pang, not of envy, but of something else, a deep, gnawing unease. It felt like the whole world was moving in a direction he couldn't follow and didn't want to. That harvest, the whispers in town grew louder. Silas had to stop twice to make repairs. A bearing went out on one of the straw walkers, and he spent a full day with the back of the combine torn apart, his arms buried deep in the machine's greasy innards. The men drinking coffee at the co-op elevator shook their heads. "Poor old Silas," they'd say. "Too stubborn for his own good. Gable was done cutting a week ago." What they didn't see was that while Frank was done, he was also on the phone every other day with the dealership. The complex hydraulic system on his new 6600 was finicky. A sensor failed, and he had to wait for a service truck to come out from town. He complained that the dealer charged him $100 just for the service call. Silas, meanwhile, fixed his own breakdowns with parts he had on hand or could get from the salvage yard for a few dollars. At the end of the season, Silas's corn made just as much per bushel as Frank's. The difference was, nearly every dollar of Silas's check went into his pocket. The lion's share of Frank's went straight to the bank and the dealership. Nobody at the co-op talked about that. They only saw the shiny new machine and the speed of the harvest. The next few years were a blur of prosperity that felt almost unreal. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of its own, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. wheat crop. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been $1.50 a bushel, shot up to $3, then $3.50. Soybeans doubled. Suddenly, every farmer in the county felt rich. The change was visible everywhere. New pickups appeared in driveways. Wives were driving new wood-paneled station wagons. Kitchens were being remodeled, and families were taking vacations to Florida for the first time in their lives. The mantra from the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butts, was repeated like a prayer. Plant fence row to fence row. Old pastures were ploughed under. Woodlots that had stood for a century were bulldozed to make way for a few more acres of corn. And at the center of it all was Chet Miller. His dealership expanded, adding 2 more service bays and a massive new showroom. He was no longer just selling combines and tractors. He was selling a dream. The dream of endless growth, of bigger yields, of farming as a modern, high-tech business. He was the high priest of leverage, and the farmers of Jackson County were his congregation. Frank Gable was his star pupil. Flush with cash from the high grain prices and backed by the bank, he bought the 80 acres that bordered Silas to the north. Then he bought the quarter section on the other side of the road. To work the new ground, he traded his year-old 6600 for a brand-new 7700, a machine so large it looked like it could harvest the entire county in an afternoon. He bought a new John Deere 4630 tractor with a sound guard body, a quiet, air-conditioned cab that made Silas's open station 4020 look like a relic from the Stone Age. Frank was a success story, the man everyone pointed to as the future of farming. He was featured in the local paper, standing in front of his new equipment, a confident smile on his face. Silas watched it all with a quiet sense of dread. He was making more money than he ever had in his life. The farm was completely paid off now. The original mortgage his father had taken out in the 40s finally satisfied. He had a healthy savings account and a lockbox full of government bonds. By any sane measure, he was a wealthy man. But in the feverish atmosphere of the mid-70s, he looked like a failure. He still drove the same F100. He still ran the 4020, which he'd overhauled himself one winter, rebuilding the diesel engine from the crankshaft up, and he still cut his corn and soybeans with the old John Deere 55. Each year it got a little harder to find parts. Each year it seemed to break down a little more often. But each year, at the end of the season, it put the crop in the bin. The pressure to change was immense. It came from all sides. Martha would gently point out new combines in the farm magazines. His own son, who was in high school and helping on the farm, would complain about how hot and dusty the old 4020 was compared to the Gable's new tractor. At the elevator, men would stop asking for his advice and start giving him theirs. "You know, Silas," one of them said, leaning against a bag of seed corn, "land prices are never going to be this cheap again. You ought to leverage that place of yours and buy up some ground. You're sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a garden patch." Silas would just nod and say, "Maybe so." He remembered his father's stories of the Depression, stories of neighbors who had borrowed big in the 20s, only to be wiped out when the bottom fell out. His father had survived by having no debt, by making do and fixing what he had. "The bank is your best friend when the sun is shining," his father used to say. "But they're the first ones to take your coat when it starts to rain." The sun was shining brighter than ever now, but Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he could feel a cold wind blowing from somewhere far off. One crisp October evening, at the peak of harvest, the feeling became undeniable. He was finishing up the last 10 acres of soybeans, the old 55, chugging along faithfully under a sky full of stars. The machine was running well, the familiar clatter and hum a comforting rhythm in the cool night air. Across the road, Frank Gable's new 7700 was also at work, its powerful halogen lights cutting a massive swath through the darkness. It moved twice as fast as Silas's machine, a relentless, efficient predator gobbling up acres. Silas stopped at the end of the field to unload into his grain truck. He shut down the combine, and the sudden silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant roar of Frank's machine. He climbed down from the operator's platform, his body aching from a long day of being vibrated and bounced around on the hard steel seat. He leaned against the truck's fender, drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos, and watched the lights of the 7700 glide across the neighboring field. It was a beautiful, impressive sight. He could hear the faint sound of the radio playing in its air-conditioned cab. It represented everything he was not: modern, leveraged, expansive, and confident. His own machine, the old 55, sat silent in the darkness, looking small and tired, its faded paint invisible in the gloom. Paid for. Reliable. But small. He took a sip of coffee and glanced at the newspaper lying on the seat of his truck. A small headline on the business page caught his eye. It was about the Federal Reserve Chairman, a man named Arthur Burns, and his concerns about runaway inflation. The article mentioned something about raising interest rates to cool down the economy. Most people would have skipped right over it. But Silas read it twice, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He didn't know much about economics, but he knew what happened when the cost of borrowing money went up. And he knew that nearly every new tractor, every new combine, every new acre of land in Jackson County was bought with borrowed money. He looked back at the brilliant lights of the 70s SF100, a symbol of the boundless optimism of the era. And for the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of progress. It looked like a target. The good years ended abruptly in the winter of 1980. Silas was in his machine shed, grinding a valve seat for the 42-tonnes cylinder head when the news came over the crackling AM radio on the workbench. The president was on the air, his voice grave, announcing a full embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. It was meant to be a punishment, a geopolitical chess move played on a global scale. But for the farmers in Jackson County, it was a punch to the gut. The single biggest customer for American grain was gone overnight. Silas shut off the grinder. In the ringing silence, he could almost hear the bottom falling out of the market. The $3 corn, the foundation upon which all the new debt was built, was about to become a memory. He walked to the door of the shed and looked out across the frozen, snow-dusted fields. The sun was shining, but the cold wind his father had warned him about had finally arrived. That spring, the sky went dry. The easy, soaking rains of the 70s were replaced by a brassy, unforgiving sun. By June, the corn was stunted, the leaves rolling up tight during the day to conserve what little moisture they could find. The ground in the fields cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. It was a physical manifestation of the financial drought that was strangling the county. With commodity prices in freefall and a crop failure looming, the first whispers of trouble began. The pressure landed first on Frank Gable. The payments on his land and his fleet of new equipment were immense, calculated on the assumption of $5 beans and 150 bushel corn. With beans struggling to make $3 and the drought-stunted corn looking like it might not even make 80 bushels, the math no longer worked. The breaking point came in October, during a harvest that felt more like a salvage operation. Silas was out with the old 55, slowly, carefully picking his way through the brittle soybean stalks, trying to save every precious pod. The machine was slow, but it was light, and it sipped diesel. Across the fence, Frank's massive 7700 was parked at the edge of the field, silent. It had been sitting there for 3 days. Silas finished a round and saw Frank walking across the stubble toward him. Frank's face was pale and drawn, the confident swagger of the boom years completely gone. "Got a minute, Si?" he asked, his voice rough. Silas throttled down the 55's engine. "Sure, Frank. What's the trouble?" "It's the hydrostat," Frank said, kicking at a dirt clod. "The main pump went out. Just quit. No warning." Silas winced. A hydrostatic transmission was a marvel of engineering, allowing for infinitely variable ground speed without shifting gears. It was also a complex, high-pressure hydraulic system that was a nightmare to fix. "Chet send a man out?" Silas asked. Frank let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Oh, he sent a man out. Took him a full day to diagnose it. Said the pump is shot. Probably contaminated the whole system with metal filings. It needs a full flush and a new pump assembly. The part alone is $4,000. $4,000. And it has to come from the regional depot in Moline. Might be here in a week, if we're lucky. Labor will be another $2,000 on top of that." He gestured at the sky, where a line of dark, bruised-looking clouds was building on the western horizon. "And now the radio says there's a storm front coming through this weekend. Hail, maybe. I've got 300 acres of beans left to cut, and my 6-figure combine is a lawn ornament." Silas looked at the silent green monster, then back at his own chugging, rattling machine. His last breakdown had been a broken drive chain for the grain auger. The repair had taken him 45 minutes and cost him $16 for a new length of number 50 roller chain he already had hanging on a nail in his shed. He looked at Frank's desperate face. This wasn't the time for "I told you so." This was a neighbor in trouble. "Well," Silas said slowly, "the 55 isn't fast, but she's running. When I finish this field, I'll come over and start on your North 80. It's better than letting it rot on the stalk." Frank stared at him, his eyes welling up. He looked like he wanted to say something, but all he could manage was a choked, "Thanks, Si." That week, the two men worked side by side. Silas ran the old combine, and Frank drove the grain truck, the two of them working long into the night under the single dim headlight of the 55. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The quiet rhythm of the harvest was its own conversation, a somber acknowledgement that the party was well and truly over. The first cracks in Chet Miller's empire appeared that winter. The once gleaming showroom was now crowded with used equipment, trade-ins he couldn't move and, for the first time, repossessions, tractors and combines taken back from farmers who had missed their payments. Each one represented a broken dream, and Chet's dealership was starting to look like a funeral home for the new era he had helped create. His smooth sales pitch was gone, replaced by a strained, hollow cheerfulness that fooled no one. The easy credit had vanished, and now the hard reality was setting in. The real collapse came like a tidal wave the following year. To combat the nation's runaway inflation, the Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker, cranked interest rates to levels not seen in a lifetime. The prime rate, the number that dictated the cost of borrowing money, soared to 21%. For farmers like Frank Gable, who held variable rate operating loans, it was a death sentence. A loan that had been manageable at 8% was now an anchor dragging him to the bottom at 20. At the same time, the value of his land, the collateral for all that debt, was plummeting. In the mid-70s, good cropland had sold for $2,000 an acre. Now, you couldn't get $800 for it. Farmers were trapped. They owed more on their land than it was worth, and the interest payments alone were more than the land could ever hope to produce. The foreclosure notices began to appear in the county paper, small, dense blocks of text that read like obituaries. The auction started soon after. They were grim, heart-breaking affairs. Entire lives, generations of work, sold off piece by piece under a cold grey sky. Neighbours stood in silence, their hats in their hands, as the auctioneer's chant sent a family's possessions scattering to the winds for pennies on the dollar. Men who had been proud and prosperous just a few years earlier now stood with their heads bowed, watching strangers haul away their tools, their tractors, their history. Silas went to one auction for a family down the road. He didn't go to buy. He went to bear witness. He watched as a John Deere 4440, a tractor the owner had bought new just 3 years prior for $35,000, sold for $10,000. He saw family heirlooms, tools worn smooth by a grandfather's hands, sold for $1 a box. The farmer's wife was serving coffee and cookies from a folding table, a brave, trembling smile fixed on her face as her world was dismantled around her. Silas couldn't stomach it. He left before they got to the land. He drove to town, needing something, anything, to feel normal. He stopped at the John Deere dealership. The place was a ghost town. The big glass showroom was half empty. In the back lot, a long, sad line of repossessed equipment sat rusting, the green paint faded, the tires going flat. Weeds grew up around the disc blades and cultivator shanks. He found Chet Miller in his office, not on the phone making a deal, but sitting at his desk, staring at a mountain of paperwork. He looked 10 years older. The ambition in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion. "Silas," he said, his voice flat. He didn't even try to sell him anything. "Came to get a hydraulic filter for the 4020, Silas said quietly. Chet nodded and got up, walking with the heavy gait of a defeated man. As he rummaged through the dusty shelves in the parts department, the silence stretched between them. "You were right," Chet said suddenly, his back still to Silas. The words were quiet, almost a whisper. "I pushed these guys too hard. I sold them a dream the banks cooked up. Get big or get out. Plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row." He turned around, a filter box in his hand, his face a mask of regret. I never thought it would end like this. I'm losing the dealership, Silas. The bank is calling my notes. Deere wants their money for the inventory. It's all coming apart." He set the filter on the counter. "Remember that day you came in for the pulley for your 55? I held up that broken part and told you it was going to cost you your farm." He shook his head slowly, a bitter smile touching his lips. Turns out, it was all this new stuff that cost everyone else theirs. Silas paid for the filter. He didn't say, "I told you so." There was no victory in being right when the cost was the destruction of his community. He just nodded at Chet, a silent acknowledgement of a hard lesson learned too late by too many. That winter, while the financial storm raged around him, Silas's farm was an island of calm. He had no debt. His savings, tucked away in modest government bonds, were safe. The low grain prices hurt, but his costs were so low he could still make a small profit. He spent the cold months in his shed, not out of necessity, but out of habit. He did a full overhaul on the 55 six-cylinder engine, replacing the piston sleeves and bearings, grinding the valves, ensuring it would be ready for another season. The work was methodical, reassuring. Every tightened bolt was an affirmation of his philosophy. Martha would bring him coffee, and they would sit on upturned buckets, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling not rich, but secure. They were survivors. In the farm crisis of the 1980s, that was the only kind of wealth that mattered. The notice for Frank Gable's auction appeared in the paper in late March. 160 acres, a 3-bedroom house, and a full line of late-model John Deere equipment to be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. The farm to be sold included Frank's original 80 acres, the piece of ground his father had homesteaded, the heart of his family's legacy. Silas read the notice at the kitchen table, a profound sadness settling over him. He saw Frank at the co-op a few days later. Frank looked like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had lost everything: the new land, the big equipment, and now the home place. The day of the auction was cold and windy, the sky the color of lead. A small crowd of somber-faced farmers and a few sharp-suited men from the bank gathered on the steps. Frank and his wife stood off to one side, huddled together against the wind and the crushing weight of public failure. Chet Miller wasn't there. His dealership had closed its doors for good the week before. The auctioneer, a man Silas had known his whole life, started the proceedings. He spoke of the quality of the land, the productivity of the farm, but his voice lacked its usual enthusiastic cadence. Everyone knew this wasn't a sale. It was a dissection. They sold the equipment first. The giant 7700 combine, the one that had cost Frank over $100,000, sold for $22,000 to a corporate farm from 2 counties over. The big 4630 tractor went for a fraction of its value. Piece by piece, Frank's dream was auctioned away. Then came the land. It was offered in 2 parcels: the 80 acres Frank had bought during the boom, and the home 80, with the house and the barns. The bidding on the new 80 was sluggish. The bankers looked nervous. It finally sold for a painfully low price. Then the auctioneer turned to the final parcel. "All right, folks," he said, "here it is. The home place. 80 acres, a good house, solid barns. Who'll start the bidding for me?" Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet, looking at the ground. No one wanted to be the one to take a neighbor's home. The man from the bank opened the bidding at a low, almost insulting number. Another banker raised him. It looked like the bank was going to end up owning it. Then, from the back of the crowd, a clear, steady voice said, "50,000. Every head turned. It was Silas Blackwood. He stood tall, his face calm, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. He hadn't come to gloat or to pick at the bones. He had come with his life's savings, the money he had carefully put away during the very boom that had destroyed his neighbor. The bankers huddled, whispering. They counted. Silas raised them. The bidding went back and forth, Silas's voice never wavering. He wasn't bidding with the bank's money. He was bidding with 20 years of sweat, frugality, and patience. Finally, the banker shook his head. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the tense silence. "To Silas Blackwood." A quiet murmur went through the crowd. Frank Gable just stared, his mouth agape, a torrent of conflicting emotions washing over his face. Shock, shame, confusion. Silas didn't walk over to the bankers to sign the papers. He walked straight to Frank. He stood before the man who had once pitied him, the man who had represented the new way that had failed so spectacularly. "Frank," Silas said, his voice low so only Frank and his wife could hear, "I don't want your house. I don't want your home. This land should stay with a Gable." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It wasn't a contract. It was just a page from a notepad with some figures scribbled on it. "Here's the deal," Silas said. "You and your family stay in the house. You farm this 80. You pay me fair cash rent, what the ground can actually support, not what the bankers dream up. Every year, whatever you can pay above that rent goes toward buying it back from me at the price I just paid. No interest. It might take you 20 years, it might take you 30, but when you're done, it's yours again. Free and clear." Frank's wife let out a sob, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. Frank looked at Silas, his eyes shining with tears, unable to comprehend the grace he was being shown. "Why, Si?" he stammered. "After everything?" "Why?" Silas looked out over the fields, the same fields the two of them had worked as boys. "Because the bank doesn't care about this land," he said. "It's just numbers on a ledger to them. To us, it's home, and a neighbor ought to help a neighbor stay home." In the years that followed, the story of what Silas Blackwood did on the courthouse steps became a local legend. The community's perspective, which had once shifted from respect to pity for Silas, now swung to something deeper. Reverence. He had proven that wealth wasn't about the size of your tractor or the number of acres you farmed. It was about character, resilience, and the freedom that came from being beholden to no one but yourself and your land. The farm economy slowly healed, but it was scarred and changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hard-won caution. Silas's farm became a quiet hub. Younger farmers who were trying to get by with older, second-hand equipment would stop by his machine shed. He never preached, but he would show them how to time an injection pump, how to weld a cracked frame, how to make do with what they had. He was teaching them the gospel of survival. His own son, Tom, came home from agricultural college in the late 80s, full of new ideas about precision farming and computer models. One evening, he brought home a brochure for a brand new combine, a John Deere 9500, with a full-color picture of it cutting a massive swathe of wheat. "Dad," Tom said, spreading the brochure on the kitchen table. "Look at this. GPS yield mapping, climate-controlled cab. It's 3 times as efficient as the old 55. Silas looked at the glossy pictures. He looked at the price at the bottom of the page and whistled softly. He didn't say no. He just stood up and said, "Come with me." He led Tom out to the machine shed. In the back, covered by a canvas tarp, sat the John Deere 55. It was clean, the grease wiped off, retired but not forgotten. Next to it, on a shelf, sat 2 cast-iron pulleys. One was cracked clean through. The other was old, salvaged but solid. Silas picked them both up. "Your grandfather and I bought this combine in 1958, he said, his voice quiet. "Paid cash. A few years later, a salesman held this broken pulley up in front of a crowd and told me it was going to cost me my farm. He said I was a fool for not borrowing every penny I could to buy a new one." He handed the broken pulley to his son. "This is what easy credit and big promises look like. It shines for a while, but it's brittle. It'll break under pressure." Then he handed Tom the salvaged pulley, its surface pitted with age but its core solid. "And this," he said, "is what it means to be free. It ain't pretty. It takes more work. You get greasy. You have to spend time in the junkyard. But it's yours. No banker can ever take it from you. When the storm comes, this is what holds." He looked his son in the eye. "I'm not saying we'll run this old girl forever. But before we sign any papers that put a lien on this farm, you'd better be damn sure you know the difference between these 2 pieces of iron." Tom held the 2 pulleys, feeling the weight of the lesson in his hands. It was a lesson that wasn't taught in any college classroom. It was a legacy of wisdom, paid for in sweat and grease and quiet defiance. Silas lived to be a very old man. He eventually handed the reins of the farm over to Tom, who farmed it successfully and with caution. Frank Gable, true to his word, worked for 31 years, and on his 65th birthday, he delivered the final payment to Silas, buying back his family's land. The 2 old men, their faces mapped with the lines of 100 seasons, shook hands on the porch, their shared history a bond stronger than any contract. On warm summer evenings, Silas would sit on that porch, watching the sun set over the fields. He'd see the new, larger equipment his son now used, but he'd also see the old machine shed, a testament to a different time. He'd think about Chet Miller, the salesman of dreams, and Frank Gable, the man who bought them, and himself, the stubborn fool who refused. He had never gotten big. He had simply endured. And in the end, he had both his farm and his soul intact. The low, rumbling sound of the distant machinery was a peaceful sound now, the sound of a legacy secured, a lesson learned, a quiet vindication written not in dollars, but in the rich, dark soil of home.